Hey everyone! This is a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button. It lets me know that you are enjoying my content. Also, feel free to drop your suggestions for future stories in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and let's dive right in. The first thing that struck me about the Coca-Cola bottling plant in Roswell, New Mexico, was how wrongly quiet it was. For a factory that ran 24/7, I expected a constant buzz of workers, voices, footsteps, something. Instead, the only sound outside was a deep, industrial hum, as if the building itself was breathing in its sleep. It was massive, stretched out under the night sky like a metal carcass, glowing faintly under flickering floodlights. A red neon Coca-Cola sign buzzed unevenly, one of the letters struggling to stay lit. The whole place felt abandoned, but it wasn't. I adjusted my bag strap and pushed through the heavy employee entrance doors. The inside wasn't much better. The air was thick, warm, and cloyingly sweet. It smelled like syrup left out in the sun too long, overripe and suffocating. The walls were lined with old safety posters, but something about them unsettled me, like they had been here so long they didn't mean anything anymore. I expected some kind of orientation, maybe a friendly face to greet me. Instead, I found Jerry. Or rather, Jerry found me. He was already sitting in the break room when I walked in, slouched in a plastic chair, arms crossed, a permanent scowl on his face. "You the new girl?" I nodded. He barely reacted, didn't stand, didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he dug into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and slid it across the table toward me. "Read these. Just follow the rules, will you?" "No, welcome to the team." "No, let me show you around." "Just this." I hesitated before picking it up, smoothing it out. The paper was wrinkled, stained, like it had been passed around too many hands before mine. As I read, my stomach twisted. Factory rules for night shift employees. 1. If you see a bottle without a label moving down the conveyor belt, do not touch it. Do not acknowledge it. Let it pass. 2. If the bottling machine suddenly stops, do not try to fix it yourself. Step back, count to 10, and wait for it to resume. 3. If you hear something knocking inside the syrup tanks, do not investigate. The tanks are not supposed to be hollow. 4. Do not stare at the label printer for too long. If you see words that shouldn't be there, look away immediately. 5. If you see a bottle dated more than 20 years in the future, immediately place it in the disposal chute. Do not drink it. Do not keep it. 6. If a spill does not dry or evaporate after 10 minutes, leave the area. Report it, but do not try to clean it. If you find an empty bottle standing upright at your station, leave it. Someone else will take care of it. 7. Always clock out before the factory's closing chime. Staying late has consequences. I let out a half laugh, expecting Jerry to crack a grin, tell me this was some kind of inside joke for the new employees. He didn't. He didn't even look at me. "This is a joke, right?" "Nothing." His eyes stayed on the table like I wasn't even worth the effort of eye contact. He just stood, stretched, and finally muttered, "Just do your job." Then he left. And that was it. My entire orientation. I swallowed hard, gripping the paper a little too tight. What the hell kind of place did I just start working at? I wandered deeper into the factory, the rhythmic hum of machines growing louder. The place was far too empty for comfort. There were workers in the distance, but something about them unsettled me. They moved in slow, deliberate motions, as if each step was pre-calculated, each task executed with unnatural precision. No one was chatting or checking their phones. No one looked bored, distracted, tired, all the things you'd expect from night shift workers. They were just working. Their motions synchronized with the machines, almost too in sync, like cogs in a much bigger system. I shook off the creeping unease and found my station. The conveyor belt. My job was simple: watch the bottles, make sure nothing jammed or overflowed. Easy. I took a deep breath, adjusted my stance, and focused. I just had to follow the rules. I just had to make it through the night. The conveyor belt hummed, rattled, its rhythm strangely soothing. I didn't notice at first, but my breathing had synced with it. Inhale, exhale, shift, clank, buzz. It was almost hypnotic, like the factory was lulling me into a pattern, setting a pace for me to follow. That's when I saw it. A bottle. No label. It glided toward me just like the others, same shape, same perfect red cap, the familiar golden liquid inside. But it was wrong. The label should have been there. They all had labels, it was part of the process. My fingers twitched. Just grab it, fix it. It was instinct, a reflex hammered into me from every shitty retail job I'd ever worked. See something out of place? Fix it. I reached out before I could stop myself. Jerry's voice echoed in my head. If you see a bottle without a label, do not touch it. Do not acknowledge it. Let it pass. Something in my gut twisted. I snatched my hand back like I'd almost burned myself. The bottle slid past. Smooth, slow, deliberate. I forced myself to look away, pretending I hadn't seen it at all. For a split second, out of the corner of my eye, I swore I saw it twitch. Like it had reacted. Like it had noticed my hesitation. The hairs on my arms stood up. A sudden chill washed over me, despite the factory's thick, humid air. But then, nothing. The bottle disappeared down the line, swallowed by the machines. The factory hummed along, unbothered. I exhaled slowly. That was it, right? Nothing happened. So why did my pulse still feel so damn loud in my ears? I tried to shake it off, but the feeling lingered. Something about the way the machines moved, so precise, so mechanical, so alive. Like they were listening, like they were waiting. My station was just a few feet away from the syrup tanks. Massive metal drums, each the size of a car, storing the concentrated syrup before it was mixed with carbonated water. That's when I heard it. A sound that did not belong. Knock. It was faint, almost too quiet to notice beneath the hum of machinery. Then, knock, knock. I turned toward the tanks. The sound was slow, deliberate, like someone was inside tapping for attention. That didn't make sense. The syrup tanks weren't hollow. They were completely sealed, filled to the brim. Even if something was inside, there'd be no room to move. A tightness coiled in my chest. I took a step closer. Knock. This time it was louder, a little too loud. Like whatever was inside knew I was listening. I swallowed hard. The factory lights flickered just for a second. And then Jerry's rule hit me like a gut punch. If you hear something knocking inside the syrup tanks, do not investigate. The tanks are not supposed to be hollow. I backed away. The knocking stopped. Just like that. Like it had never happened. Like it was never meant for me in the first place. A shiver crawled up my spine, and this time, I couldn't shake it off. I turned back to the conveyor belt, forcing my hands to stay still. Just focus on the job. Don't think about the bottle. Don't think about the knocking. But I felt it now. The weight of something unseen. Like the factory had noticed me, and it was waiting to see what I'd do next. I didn't even hear him approach. Good, the man muttered. You followed the rules. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. There he was, Sam. At least that is what the name tag said. A worker I hadn't seen before. Pale, tired eyes, his uniform stained with syrup and time. He looked like he hadn't slept in years. His words sat heavy in my chest. You keep doing that, he said, voice low. And maybe you'll get to leave. I swallowed hard. What's that supposed to mean? Sam didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the conveyor belt, watching the bottles slide by with unnatural focus. You ever wonder why this place is so successful? His voice was barely above a whisper, but I caught every word. There's always people working, but... He finally looked at me, and his eyes were too empty, too knowing. Not all of them clock out. A chill slid down my spine like ice water. What the hell does that mean? I asked. You saying people stay here overnight? But before he could answer, the bottling machine stopped. The hum of the factory died instantly. Silence. Total silence. It was the kind of silence that felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath. I turned toward the machine. It was completely still, half-filled bottles hanging motionless in place, red caps caught mid-spin. Instinct took over. I reached for the control panel, and then I remembered rule number 2. If the bottling machine suddenly stops, do not try to fix it yourself. Step back, count to 10, and wait for it to resume. My hands froze inches away from the panel. Everything in me screamed to fix it. I didn't even know why. I just needed the factory to start moving again. It felt wrong, unnatural, like a heartbeat that had suddenly stopped. I forced myself to take a step back, and then another. Deep breath. Count to 10. 1. The silence grew heavier. 2. I felt like something was waiting, watching. 3. My pulse hammered in my ears. 4. Something shifted inside the machine, a low grinding sound like metal being pushed against flesh. 5. The conveyor belt twitched, just once, like something inside it had moved. 6. I thought I saw a shadow behind the glass window of the control panel. 7. The machine groaned. It sounded almost alive. 8. I clenched my fists. My breathing was too shallow. 9. The grinding stopped. 10. The machine roared back to life. The conveyor belt jolted forward, bottles sliding smoothly once again. The red caps twisted into place, as if nothing had happened at all. I let out a shaky breath, legs stiff, heart hammering. Sam just nodded, like I'd done something right, like I'd passed another test. And I hated that. I didn't say anything. I just turned back to my work. The next hour passed in a blur. I kept my head down, focused on the bottles, avoiding anything that felt even remotely off. But then I noticed the label printer. A small red machine, positioned just above the conveyor belt, spitting out thousands of Coca-Cola labels. They blurred past, a constant stream of the same white script on red. But then, something changed. For 1 second I saw something that should not have been there. Get out, don't look back. The words flashed past the rollers, clear as day. My breath caught. My fingers clenched. I blinked, and the label was gone. Like it had never been there at all. Rule number 4. Do not stare at the label printer for too long. If you see words that shouldn't be there, look away immediately. I ripped my gaze away, forcing myself to breathe. I knew now. This wasn't just a factory. It was something else, something alive, and it was testing me, seeing if I belonged. I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out what happened if I failed. Somewhere in the distance, a spill hit the floor. I heard it splat, thick and syrupy. One of the other workers, one of the strange, paused mid-task. I didn't turn my head, but I could feel them standing still, waiting. I glanced at the mess, and something about it made my stomach drop. The spill wasn't drying. I stared at it, my breath caught in my chest. Dark red syrup oozed across the factory floor, pooling in the cracks between the tiles. It should have thinned out, should have started to evaporate under the industrial lights. But it just sat there, thick and wrong, like it was sinking into the concrete itself. I felt the factory shift. Not physically, but in the air. The machine still hummed, the conveyor belt still moved, but something about the space had changed. The weight of it pressed down on my shoulders, on my skull, like the walls themselves were leaning in, listening. I checked the time. 8 minutes left. I swallowed hard. Rule number 6. If a spill does not dry or evaporate after 10 minutes, leave the area. Report it, but do not try to clean it. I took a step back. The spill twitched. I froze. No, not twitched. It moved, like something underneath the floor had sucked at the liquid, drinking it in. My hands clenched at my sides. I took another step back. The spill vanished. 1 second it was there. The next, gone. Like it had never happened. I turned slowly, scanning the factory floor. The workers hadn't moved, hadn't looked up. No one else had noticed, or maybe they just knew better than to react. I forced myself back to the conveyor belt, keeping my breathing steady, controlled. I needed to focus. No more distractions. Just follow the rules. The bottles moved past me, one by one, each capped and labeled, perfect and identical. And then, I saw it. A bottle, dated 20 years into the future. My stomach lurched. It looked exactly the same as every other bottle. Same red cap, same Coca-Cola logo. But the expiration date, March 2nd, 2045. Rule number 5. If you see a bottle dated more than 20 years in the future, immediately place it in the disposal chute. Do not drink it. Do not keep it. My hands trembled as I grabbed it, fingers wrapping around the slick plastic. It was cold. Too cold. Like it had been sitting in a freezer for hours, except it hadn't. I turned toward the disposal chute, a large red bin marked waste, and then the bottle twitched in my grip. I nearly dropped it. No, not twitched. Something moved inside, a ripple, a shift, like something inside was alive. A voice in my head whispered, "Don't open it. Don't look." I tossed it into the chute, and as it hit the bottom, I swear to God, something inside the bottle screamed. Muffled, high-pitched, distorted like a voice played backward. I stumbled away from the bin, heart pounding. The sound cut off instantly. The factory hummed, buzzed, moved, like it was satisfied. I swallowed hard. I didn't know what would have happened if I'd kept that bottle, and I didn't want to find out. A sharp clink echoed from the conveyor belt. I turned toward the sound, and my breath caught in my throat. The empty bottle stood at my station, waiting. A perfect, upright cylinder of nothing. The factory light glistened off its smooth plastic surface, the cap still on, but the inside completely hollow. I swallowed hard. Rule number 7. If you find an empty bottle standing upright at your station, leave it. Someone else will take care of it. I didn't move. I wanted to throw it away, knock it over, do something, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to listen to the rule. So I stepped back and waited. The factory hummed along, machines clanking, conveyor belts rolling, but it felt different now. Like everything around me was holding its breath. Then, a worker approached. He walked slowly, mechanically, his footsteps perfectly timed with the rhythm of the conveyor belt. His uniform was pristine, not a drop of syrup or sweat on it. He picked up the bottle, didn't examine it, didn't hesitate, just lifted it with careful, practiced precision. I waited for him to drink, but he didn't. He just held it and turned away. His movements were too smooth, too unnatural. I felt my stomach twist as I finally noticed he never blinked, not once. His eyes were glassy, almost plastic-like, reflecting the factory lights like a mannequin's face. He walked back to his station, bottle in hand, and resumed his task without ever looking up. The factory breathed. Not a sound changed. Not a single other worker reacted. But I felt it, a pulse beneath my feet. Like the factory was pleased, like I had done exactly what it wanted. I watched them more closely now. The other workers, the way they moved, the way they worked. They never blinked. They never wiped sweat from their foreheads, never stretched, never took a breath too deep or too shallow. I'd been so caught up in following the rules, in not dying, that I hadn't truly looked at them. These people, they weren't people. They weren't workers. They were part of the factory. I turned to find Sam, but he was already there, standing just behind me, arms crossed, watching. He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "You saw it, huh?" My voice felt trapped in my throat. They don't leave," he muttered, like he was already exhausted from explaining this before. "They don't stop. They don't need food, water, rest." His gaze flicked to the workers, then back to me. "They're part of it now." I shook my head. No, that didn't make sense. People don't just become machines. I took a slow step back. "Then why are we still?" "Because we haven't broken the wrong rule yet." His voice was flat, final. That's when I noticed his hands. His fingernails were cracked, like he'd been clawing at something. His sleeves were pushed up just enough to reveal dark bruises circling his wrists, like he'd tried to pull away from something that wouldn't let go. He saw me looking and rolled his sleeves down. "Listen to me, Linda." His voice was low, urgent. "If you want to leave, you have to clock out before the closing chime." I frowned. "Closing chime?" Sam clenched his jaw. "Midnight. That sound you heard when the shift started? There's another one at the end. If you don't clock out before then." He exhaled sharply. "You don't go home." I turned toward the old analog clock on the factory wall. 11:52 p.m. 8 minutes. 8 minutes to get to the clock-out station, scan my ID, and walk out of here like a normal shift worker. Except nothing about this was normal. The conveyor belt jammed with a sharp metallic screech, the machine sputtering like a dying animal. The workers turned toward me, slow, deliberate, all at once. Their glass-like eyes locked onto me, heads tilting slightly in unison, like they knew. Like they had always known. I took a step back, pulse hammering. Then I ran. The air thickened, growing hot and suffocating, like trying to run through wet cement. My feet felt heavier with every step, like the floor itself was dragging me down. I dodged past the workers, slow but purposeful, their movements mechanical, their hands twitching like they wanted to reach out but weren't allowed. I reached the main aisle, sprinting past rows of machinery, my ID badge clutched so tight my fingers ached. Behind me, the factory stuttered, failed, restarted. The machines groaned, conveyor belts jerked violently, bottles toppled over, shattering like glass, even though they were plastic. Something in the walls shifted, like the whole building had inhaled, like it was about to swallow me whole. 11:58 p.m. I saw the scanner station up ahead, the last checkpoint before the exit. Just a few more steps. And then they moved, the workers. Not slowly this time. They stepped directly into my path. A wall of blank faces, empty eyes, rigid postures. They didn't touch me. They just stood there, blocking my way. Waiting. For me to make the wrong choice. I hesitated. My mind screamed to run another way. But that's what the factory wanted. It wanted me off course, lost, trapped. I gritted my teeth, braced myself, and charged straight through them. Their bodies were cold, like metal left in a freezer. They didn't fight back. Didn't grab me. They just let me pass, like I was no longer their problem. 11:58 p.m. The exit door was ahead. I lunged for the scanner, and the factory screamed. Not a sound from the machines, not the whir of conveyor belts or grinding metal. The entire building roared. A deep, hollow, inhuman sound that rattled my bones. The factory shook, like it was coming apart at the seams. I slammed my ID onto the scanner. Beep! The lock clicked open. I threw my weight against the door, stumbled outside, gasping for air. And then, the doors slammed shut behind me. The noise stopped instantly. The factory went back to humming, quiet and undisturbed, like I had never been there at all. I stood there, my breath coming in sharp bursts. I looked back. Through the small factory window, the workers had already turned away, back to their tasks, like nothing had happened, like I never existed. And then I saw him. Jerry. Standing by the office window, cigarette between his lips, watching me. He exhaled a long stream of smoke, then gave me a half nod. Then he turned away. I walked to my car in a daze, my hands still shaking. I had done everything right. I had followed the rules, and the factory had let me go. This time. But as I sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, I realized it had been a choice. The factory had decided. Tonight, I was allowed to leave. Next time, maybe it wouldn't be so forgiving.